biggest project of the year by far. This is epic. The main experiment here is to make a long-form generative project, which means there's a piece of code that outputs artworks. Each one is different, so each one of these artworks actually in this project can be combined. They can be joined like two jigsaw puzzle pieces. So only specific pieces can be joined with other specific pieces. The edges have to match. And then when those two artworks are combined, and that also means that the collector has to own both of those pieces and have them in the same wallet. When they're combined, they unlock a new artwork, which is generated again from those two pieces, and then that collector can either sell it or they can just hold it. And there are different types of composite pieces which are harder to build than others. So obviously, like the more pieces you have in the composites, the harder they are, because you have to collect all the pieces that fit. So we're building some tools to help people find the right pieces which they need, because just doing it visually is possible, but it just takes a long time, and especially if we do end up generating thousands of outputs, if the project's successful. Hopefully that's our goal, because we're going to sell them at a reasonable price. They're going to be $100 each, with the idea that we can generate a lot of these first pieces. We call them base mints. And then so there's the potential to build these very complex composites. It's highly unlikely they will. It's highly unlikely. So we're expecting there'll be quite an active secondary market. We have contemplated creating some sort of trading platform so people can trade without paying gas, which might be necessary with the current gas prices. We don't know, but we want to make it as easy as possible for people to swap, and the idea being that would create a lot more community engagement, and people would have to work together to get the pieces they wanted. But we don't want people to have to spend unnecessary gas fees to do that, so we're looking at that problem.
How many ultimately fit together into one?
There's no limit, because actually the edge pieces, it's not like there's not a global map these all fit into. That each edge piece has like about 16 different possible permutations for how they can be arranged, kind of. So that's just more than 16. So the more pieces, base mints that are created, the more complex composite pieces you're going to be able to make. Now, there are different classes of composite pieces. So, and the more complex ones, once somebody has made one of those class of composites, nobody else can make it. So there's going to be certain kind of like grail composites that can only be made once, and then there's going to be some other sort of like less complicated composites that you can make more times. I'm not quite sure exactly what number that's going to be yet, but it's the way I picture it is like a pyramid. So at the bottom you've got the base mints, and as you go up the pyramid you get more and more complex outputs, but there's less possibility of making them, or they've been limited in some way. So you've got this structure where somebody can just get a piece of my work for $100 and maybe they're happy with that, but there's also something further up the pyramid, something right at the top for some of my collectors who want the very special exclusive piece and can afford it. There's something for them as well. So that's the basic vision for that structure, this kind of pyramid.
So because of the randomness, you don't know how many will piece together or how many will be at the very top of the pyramid?
Well, if you generate, like I generated 1,000 the other day, and there's certain edge types that appear quite often, but there's certain edge types that are very rare. So there's to join those, to get two that join together there is going to be very difficult, and those pieces are going to have a premium because they're more sought after, because they can make this rarer composite. Whereas some of the other base mints are going to be more commonly used. They're going to be kind of so there's a whole variety of different types of, and then there's actually 5 different types of aspect ratio as well. So they're not all square tiles, for instance. There's 5 different rectangles. There's a very long sort of landscape one, there's a long thin one, and there's a range in between. But the dragons in those, the dragon bodies in those, are all the same scale. So all those pieces do join together. So you can create 2 long ones and maybe have 3 horizontal ones in between. So that's a certain class of output composite, and you're only going to be able to mint them later on in the season once the simple ones are minted first. Yeah.
Is it going to cost anything to make a composite, to mint a new?
Right, good question. No. So it's going to be free, apart from the gas fee. And actually, with Verse, they do have a mechanism to try and bring that gas fee down a fair bit. So no. So basically, once you've purchased your base mints, you get the composite for free.
And do you keep the base mints?
The base mints, you keep the base mints, but they can't be used again in another composite. So what happens? They go into a regular database. It's not on chain, and it's recorded that they've been used, and then you won't be able to use them again. But you can still still hold on to them, because otherwise you end up with a scenario where a collector could just create a composite and then sell his base mints. Someone could buy those exact same base mints and make another composite same.
Yeah.
So we don't want that. It might be 12, but it's a long time. So, but I guess then there was, in a sense, it's been like 25 years in the making, because some of the geometry I developed in the first 15 years ended up morphing into this motif. But so about 15 years ago, or whenever it was, I made this. I made this big transition. I mean, it sounds kind of simplistic, but I built this whole sort of geometric system to make art with, this kind of geometric meter system, and it was all based on this. I mean, it sounds simplistic, but squares and circles, square root of 2, and then I shifted, and the basic kind of building block became like a hexagonal grid, which is so you end up with a lot of this proportion of like the square root of 3 to 1 and stuff. So you've got equilateral triangles, hexagons and stuff. And then the first kind of like motif that really grew out of that new kind of metering system was this thing that now forms the basis of Quasi Dragon. And there was some sort of properties about this motif I really liked. It had this property where it was kind of like the outside elements were kind of like it had this property where it was kind of like it had this inside and outside quality to it. So the piece right in the middle is kind of like an inversion of the pieces around the outside. It's just this really sort of beautiful. It's not really it's symmetry in a typical sense, but it's like a symmetry around the middle of the motif, if you can imagine. So like the outside of it is reflected on the inside.
Okay.
And it's probably we'll put an image in and people can see, but it has this kind of lots of different, and then it also has this kind of like property where you can combine it with other, you can kind of like tile it, not seamlessly, but it kind of it sort of fits together in really interesting ways with other pieces. So it's kind of like this jigsaw puzzle piece almost. So you can build composites, and that was apparent right from the first day I created it. Or you can do this really interesting way. So I spent a number of years to sort of experiment with different ways to like combine this together to make more complex forms. and then I kind of, you know, I revisited it a number of times, and then I got into making gen art, and for like 5 years I actually took another kind of big diversion, and I started exploring quasi crystals, which was a totally different kind of direction. And then I had some art box drops and stuff, and I remembered this project, and I thought, wow, that would be an interesting thing to explore in long form generative art. Although at the time I was like, this could be really difficult to make this because of the geometric constraint. It could just be technically quite difficult, and it was to kind of like, so the algorithm doesn't actually have any like path data in it. It's not like I've drawn these things and I put them in the algorithm. Actually everything is just created with trigonometry basically. So hopefully it's unique. I don't know of a project where the base, where mints can be joined in this way to create new ones. There's been a couple of projects where, say, three successive outputs, say mint 50, 51, 52, where they sort of join together for a triptych. But
for what?
For like a triptych, like a series of three, they kind of join together. So that's the only time I've seen generative outputs join together. But I mean, these join top and bottom and in lots of different ways. It's quite a different concept. I mean, I'm inspired by, like, obviously, like QQL was kind of really interesting last year. It was a very innovative project, and I was inspired just because it was something new. It was a genuine experiment. You didn't quite know how it was going to pan out. So with this project, with Quasi Dragon, I always wanted to do something interesting with it just because it was such a unique, you know, geometrically, aesthetically, it was very unique, and it had this potential. I knew I wanted to do something which was like a puzzle, because the geometry lent itself to that, and I wanted it to be a genuine Web3 experiment where we set it up, but we don't really know how it's going to pan out. There are some other sort of like biodynamic, like the project's going to be open, so anybody can mint until it goes 24 hours without sale. And then the project kind of closes, but it can be restarted, but the price doubles. The mint price goes up to 200, so it might stay, you know, it's likely it would stay down, but then you've got the potential for a new cycle of interest. If the floor then goes up, then if it gets up to 200 again, obviously the project will open again, and it's got this potential to go through several cycles, maybe over a number of years. But ultimately, you know, if it doubles every time, it's got a natural cap, because it can't double every time, because it'll just get to a point where it's crazy expensive.
Right.
But we also want to allow the project to, you know, build in value. You know, what it could potentially still, you know, you want to, every artist dreams of having a project which still has interest and engagement, and, you know, 5 years from now, you know, 10 years. So we wanted to create something like that where you just don't know. I mean, it might close after a day.
Right.
But it's part of the kind of, if we knew how it was going to pan out, it wouldn't be a genuine experiment.
I have a couple more questions about how it works.
Okay.
If you've created a composite that's now, so it's now on the second level of the pyramid, can that join with one of the bases?
Right. No.
No.
Once they're composites, they can't be used they can't be used as building blocks, and that's because.
Oh, I was under the impression that once they were composites, you composite them again.
Oh, okay.
To get to the top of that pyramid.
Right. So no. So like the super complex composite is just made of, say, X number 20 pieces, base pieces.
Oh.
No, there may be an exception to this, and that might be. So one of the rules of joining So to join two edges, the Quasi Dragon bodies have to intersect that edge. They have to go off. They have to be truncated by the edge, and that means you can join to another edge. Now, for the rule for the composite is that none of the dragons must go off the outside edges. So there's like an outside edge pieces, you know. This the dragon bodies must be completely contained within the composite. So and some basements are produced like that. They don't have but you can include one of those in a composite, or not one, but like no more than 25% of the tiles can be these base pieces without a dragon going off. So it's possible we might use the composites in a scenario like that.
So you could mint one that will have two edges, like a corner of a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then you know that you have a certain desirability,
right?
Because somebody is going to be looking for that corner piece,
right? And yeah, for that specific corner piece. And also, you know, the tiles where you have dragons going off all four sides are quite rare. So that they're going to be quite sought after. So for instance, if you minted one of those, the best strategy would probably be to start with that and then find the pieces that go around the edge, because they're much more common. It's going to be hard to, if you just build the pieces that go around the edge and then look for the piece that goes in the middle, it's going to be very hard to get that right piece, because it's going to match on every side.
Oh, this is so much fun.
So what I'm hoping is that I'm thinking not every collector is going to want to get into the mechanics of joining these together, because it's going to take a little time to get to know the rules and stuff. But so you may end up with a scenario where you'll get builders appear who just want to build and sell. So I actually started building the long form generative version of Quasi Dragon Studies just after I finished the Fontana algorithm, and I was waiting. You know, Fontana had been accepted as a curated project on Artbox, but then there was like a 6-week gap before I could drop it. So I started working on Quasi Dragon long form. So I built a lot of the algorithm in that 6 weeks actually, and then maybe another couple of months after that I was kind of fine tuning it. But I started sharing the posts around, you know, some outputs around there, and people were like, oh, when's this going to drop? There seemed to be a lot of excitement around those outputs, but because of this nature of, you know, because of this, I always wanted this to be some sort of puzzle, because of the way they interlock geometrically, it just lent itself to that without forcing it. And so it was just like, because of how long I've worked on it previously, this motif, how special, you know, like important this was to me, this was kind of like my special project, and I figured, well, I'll drop it when I find the right partnership. When I kind of work out what exactly I want to do with it in terms of the puzzle, the interconnectivity. But I knew I wanted it to be an experimental project, possibly kind of like a project I can then use to access other things I do later on. So it's kind of like my own personal token, like a crypto citizens type thing. But I wanted the right partnership. So, you know, and I didn't, you know, I'd asked around, okay, for different platforms where they could do certain things technically, and I hadn't found the right team. And then I was in New York for NFT NYC, and I had a meeting with Jamie from Verse about another project, about Cove Hive, I think. And I was just flicking through my Twitter, and I showed him a couple of the Quasi Dragons. No, I told him about the project. He said, what's that? I don't know if I've seen it. And I showed him. He's like, wow, can we do this? I'm like, well, yeah, I don't know. I said, well, and then we started to talk about the technical side of things. And it turns out they just got this awesome tech team. Not just an awesome tech team, but the tech team who really understands Web3. They understand drop dynamics, and they're very creative and have some great ideas. So we think, okay, maybe we can do this. And then Jamie himself just is full of ideas about drop dynamics. So we just had a little brainstorming session there, right, in Starbucks, and we were so enthusiastic about the project, and we just kind of come up with some really sort of wild ideas. And I'm like, really, you prepared to go down and do that? And they're like, yeah. So right there, we kind of decided, okay, let's do it. And we looked at the calendar, and we were originally looking at fall, just because the verse calendar is like, and then we had this opportunity to kind of like they could shuffle some things around and do it in July. And I figured, well, maybe we can get it all done and everything built by then. So we went for it. But so basically, I was just holding on to that project to find the right team, and I think Verse is definitely the right team. There's nobody else out there who I would entrust this project with. And I also just have a lot of confidence in that Verse. I look at Verse as potentially becoming the white cube, what White Cube was for the Brit artists in the 90s. I think Jamie and Verse, they're positioning themselves to be that for the next wave of kind of like important generative artists, and help them really bridge that gap to the gallery art world. Jamie, has worked in the gallery art world for 20, maybe 30 years. I'm not quite sure how old he is, but he's understands it well. He's deeply connected. He's got an art storage company, so he's connected to all the galleries. But he's one of the few people I've met who's from that world. I mean, from that world in the having been deeply enmeshed in that world, and yet still totally really gets Web3 and is very passionate about generative art. Probably one of the most passionate people I know about generative art. I think the first time I talked to him, he's like, I think this is bigger. This is going to be bigger than football, than soccer. Like, I don't think it is. But it just shows you, like, he thinks this is this for him is. He's so passionate about it, and that's rare. You don't get people who understand both spaces. There's so much confusion from the Web3 looking at traditional art, web gallery art. Well, there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a big cultural gap to bridge, and vice versa. Going the other direction. There's a lot of misunderstanding about Web3 and NFT from that world. And partly for good reason. There are, So, but Jamie gets both worlds, and so I feel really lucky to be able to work with him on this project, and I think it's the right choice.
For such a project that relies heavily on the digital market and reselling and re-minting these compilations, how is that going to look in a physical gallery space?
So we are going to have a physical show and a kind of an event after the drop. We're going to have, we're not going to have hundreds of outputs. We're going to select a bunch of, like, we want it to just look like a traditional art show. So we're going to have, we're going to give the works plenty of space to breathe. We're going to have some composite works. We're going to have some single big mints, maybe like 5-6 feet high. Have some nice, some text and just this one screen maybe with a video on it. But we've also got a smaller room where we're gonna talk more about the evolution of the project over the last 15 years. Show some earlier works. Maybe just maybe not even frame those works, but just in a way that it's clear they're kind of like more like working drawings, and just talk about that whole evolution, the story behind the project. But we want the main show to be, that's where we try to bridge that gap and get more people from the gallery art world to just come in and see the work and hopefully just let the work speak for itself, so it's not going to be anything that unconventional. The unconventional piece is on the Web3 side. So the textural elements, right? The worn. So with Quasi Dragon, because it has this, because the main theme, so to speak, visually is the geometry. This is geometric. I didn't want it to become secondary to a textural layer. There is texture in there, but not like to the extent of Cove Hive, which is deeply textural. It's just an integral part of the artwork. But with Quasi Dragon, I just wanted there to be enough just to make it more. It always makes it more more visually digestible. It makes the surface just so much more interesting. But I didn't want it to be overwhelming. And it's also, in a similar way, I sort of like distressed the edge of Fontana. I used a similar treatment with here because, and that fulfills a function, and that the dragon bodies are the pieces that join together. So everything else is kind of like doesn't necessarily join. So when you have this kind of like worn edge or blurred edge, it just makes an interface for those parts so they still kind of visually join when you're trying to join the segments. But the dragons are the pieces that actually lock together. So there's a practical reason for that being there. And of course it just I guess, with all my projects, my palettes tend to be fairly muted. Quasi Dragon is just a little bit more bold, but it still has this kind of more sort of, I'd say, kind of Eastern Japanese kind of spectrum. I don't know. The blues are quite vivid, but it's kind of like it works with the bold blues. It's kind of, I almost made the whole project blue, like the white and blue Oriental ceramics. Like the Ming, not the Ming. Anyway, so because it just works so well with the blue and the black and the white, but yeah, and some of the palette, some of the colours are a little bit more bold just because they work. Some don't, like a very, very vivid green and Quasi Dragon just doesn't, to me anyway. It's just vulgar. So and that all sort of feeds into the the texture and the color palettes should make sense together. They should work together. They should be like, if you had just bold primary colors and the distressed texture, it would just look a weird pairing because we don't tend to see things like that in real life. It's a little jarring. If something's worn, it's usually the color's usually faded.
Yeah, and I imagine with the purpose of Quasi Dragon, having the distress and color layering would be a kind of unnecessary complication when it comes to putting them together. Yeah,
you just, I didn't want it. It's enough kind of going on in the compositions with the dragon and the fan elements. Just didn't want it to become. Yeah, everything in art has to be there for a good kind of reason. You don't want too much of something for the sake of it. Just because you can do it doesn't mean it should be there. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like what I think a lot of people quite like Steve Jobs or whatever, or iPhone. It's more about what you don't put in. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should include it. Yeah, let's talk about let's talk about dragons, because I've got some things to say about dragons. So the name Quasi Dragon Studies. So I like the fact that obviously dragons are not real, we think, and that quasi is like an unreal.
Bold take.
Yeah. I'm gonna put out there that I'm not in that camp. So anyway, so I like this kind of play on words. Quasi was this unreal thing, so potentially it's real. It's a double negative, right? So it means that the dragon is real. So, and I like quasi. I think that, quasi is just a word in my mind because of the relationship to quasi crystals, which is another kind of interest of mine. I like this. So, but when I designed when I built the motif, the geometry, it didn't leap out and say dragon to me then, but as I started to kind of like add, there's this kind of like, there's two sort of components to the geometry. One is a very sort of like periodic tiled element where it's like, and then there's this kind of like part which is more organic and has a different type of geometry which relates to all my other work. This kind of, it comes from this set of kind of like Mobius transformations, and when I try different textures on there to try and kind of like give it some volume and show how these curves all related, I settled on these kind of like lines and markings that just look like scales on fish or dragon scales. And then when I started to actually expand this into a long form project, how I joined them together, they just, to me anyway, they just said, okay, these look like dragon bodies, just kind of like flowing. And then, so that was that reference. But then I do really like, I've never really liked kind of like dragon, the Western sort of take on like Dungeons and Dragons or like King Arthur, that type of dragon. But in the East, what it often represents this kind of like this link between worlds. This thing that can bridge the transcendental with the concrete world. And there's some I like that reference because that's what the geometry I use to make the dragon body. That's the property it has. It has this quality where it has this infinitely large, this set of infinite kind of like progression of circles which go from this infinitely large circle, which is a straight line, through to this point, which is an infinitely small circle, and it has this kind of the set of curves. To me, always had this expression of this kind of like almost like this bridge between worlds. So this made sense to go with a dragon, Quasi Dragon. And then the word studies just comes from, it just made it seem more kind of like, it had this very formal quality because of the geometry, and it felt like studies to me. They just had this formal sort of like a working drawing almost. So
a formal experiment.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I've always liked sort of technical drawing and so forth. So I don't know, the name just I wrote it on a file one day and it gets stuck. And yeah.
So the bridge between worlds, but in this case it's a bridge between mints.
Okay. Yeah.
Because the dragon bridges.
Exactly. You're right. It's a literal bridge. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the reason I actually used the dragon bodies to join the pieces was, and not some of the other elements, but it was just the simplest way to join things, the most obvious. That was the focal point of the piece, the composition, and joining everything else just become a technical nightmare, and it just became unnecessary. It was enough just to join it with the dragon body. Any association anybody makes to the work is fine with me, basically. There's no, I don't want to say, okay, there's only one way to interpret it, so that's one thing to say about that. Another thing, like, with this idea of destruction, maybe they don't think of this, but whenever I think about that, I think there's a fundamental connection between creativity and destruction, right? I think Picasso said, you can't make a mark on a canvas without destroying a beautiful blank canvas. There's something, every time you make a mark on a painting, you're destroying how the painting is right there and then. So whenever I think of, like, if I think of that Western sort of perspective on a destructive beast, I see that as this tremendous creative force, but that's just my personal take on the Western side of, and if they sort of like associate it with, the King Arthur dragons and so forth, and they like that kind of thing, they like the Dungeons and Dragons, and they see a reference to that in my work, it's fine as well. It's not how I see it, but it's great. If they like it, then they might like the work. So The important thing is that people like the work. Yeah.
Can you speak to how a project like this is only possible through Web3?
Okay, yeah. It seems like to me it's only possible in Web3 for many reasons. So one would be just the fact that, I mean, I can't think, I might be wrong. Whenever I think that something hasn't been done before, it has. But I can't think of an example in the gallery art world where an artist has put out a large number of pieces of work, where holders of those work can actually bring those pieces together and create something new. So actually the collector is part of the co-creation of new works, because actually there is something, there are certain combinations of works which will be quite common, so it will then become down to the collector which ones they bring together, and that will be an aesthetic choice on their part. So this is kind of like an extension of something we already see in Web3, which is pairing, sort of like this collector curation. So so there's that part of it, and the other big thing I feel like, so the mechanics of doing that I don't see equivalent in the gallery art world, how you technically be able to marry artworks together like that and make new ones, but also just the community aspect of Web3. You don't really see an equivalent of that in visual art or conceptual art in the gallery art world, where you get large communities forming around a project, engaging with it, talking about it, helping to build narrative around the work, and then having the tools and the ability to trade to the extent that we need to make the project work. Because in the gallery art world it's difficult to buy work. I've talked to a lot of collectors who were big art fans. They had the money, they didn't really collect art before Web3, because it was just too difficult. Sometimes you go into the gallery and although the piece is for sale, you can't buy it unless you're from a museum or you're an established collector. So I don't think you could have, I actually don't think you can imagine a work like this 5 years ago. I mean, I certainly couldn't have done. I mean, I'd like to think that the project is authentically Web3. It can only be imagined once you had all the pieces in, the components there, the community, the drop dynamics, all those things that we weren't thinking about 5 years ago even. Yeah. The idea of the composites. So for some of the edges, some of the edges are going to be more common than others. So there's going to be situations where the collector has if they want to if they want to join two pieces for a simple composite, or even some of the more complex ones, they're going to have a choice of pieces they can put together. And so then it comes down to the kind of aesthetic discretion of the collector. So there's this idea that they're become like part of the co-creative process of building these new composites, and I feel like that's kind of just like an extension of what we already see in Web3, which is this kind of pairing, where collectors put a lot of time and effort into kind of like bringing pieces from different collections together with a similar palette or whatever, and changing the background color. This is kind of like I think in Web3 we see kind of like a continuum between, you've got an artist at one end and a collector at the other, and then there's different, sometimes the artist will become a collector and sometimes the collector will become an artist. And you've got cases where there's some collectors who maybe make memes out of art outputs. You've got a good friend who kind of memifies a lot of my outputs, especially from Fontana, and then also some collectors who just spend a long time arranging them and pairing pieces. So, but then there's that also ties into this other phenomena I think we see in Web3, where, or not just Web3 but the internet in general, where you get very like disparate communities with very different interests come together to make something new. So, and I think that happens where you've got two communities with very different skill sets that complement each other. So, you know, traditionally you've got this, most arts generally, or creative types typically have not been very good with money, for instance. They've not been, you know, it's not been their primary. So then you have this financial group, right, who've traditionally maybe not felt like they're creatively being able to express themselves, or maybe they're not, you know, really into the arts. And so they kind of like the perfect kind of like marriage. One helps the other with the skill set they kind of like struggle with. And then, you know, you have Gen Art or whatever, NFTs emerge from that kind of intersection. That's it.
Great.
Yeah. I think another example of it is like, you don't include this, but another example of that would be spirituality and marketing. If you listen to a marketing podcast now today, you know, you very rarely do you get to the end of the show before somebody talks about compassion or being humble, you know. And then you've got spirituality, which traditionally is not very good at just like selling itself, of actually like, you know, making a message that can communicate with many people. So maybe, you know, yeah, I don't know. Let's have a think if there's anything else.